element by ID, and then we're going to grab the button, add event listener, and the event listener that we're going to add is a click. So whenever it gets clicked, add to storage. And that's the function that we're going to invoke. So next, let's create our function. So add to storage. And then within this function, so let's just, first of all, I usually like to make sure that things are working whenever I add these event listeners. And it's always a good idea just to try it out for yourself. Just make sure that it is working. So let's refresh. And I know this doesn't really look like a button, but it is working. We're able to click it. So that's exactly what we wanted to do. So once it gets clicked, then let's do a variable or do let. So just do a temporary variable, and let and const give you more scope control over your variables. So that's with ES6. So let's do let, and within let, we're gonna do temp value. So this is going to be the value of the first name, and using the document object, we use just get element by ID. So first name. So usually the easiest way to grab a value, and then within here, we're just going to output that value whenever it gets clicked. So just make sure that we're able to pick up a value. So we can do test and clicked. So we're able to pick up those new values as they get updated. So that's exactly what we want to do, because we want to store it to local storage. And then also let's add in one more button. So we'll do an add, or call it add. It's a quick update, and C button. So this is add button, that's C button. And the reason that I'm doing two buttons is because I want to have one button where we can actually see the contents of the local storage. So let me make this a little bit bigger. So we've got the two buttons, and this one, so this is going to be add to storage, and this C button is going to be the one that C storage. Or I could just call it view storage. Actually, view is probably better, sounds a little bit better. And we'll just keep it as C button, just to keep things simple. And then next, so we need to have a way to see the contents of the storage. So let's set that one up. So that's another function. And this one is going to be C storage. So we don't need to get that value, and we'll just get the clicked, make sure that the clicked is working for that one as well. So make this small again, refresh our page, and make sure that both of our buttons are working, which they are. Perfect. So next, we're ready to build out the rest of this, where we're going to actually add and set values into our local storage, and then we're also going to retrieve those values back. We've got add to storage, we've got the view storage. So this is where we actually try to get content that's contained within the storage. So let's output that content, do another variable let, and we can call it temp holder as well. So this one is going to use local storage, and it's going to get an item. So we're going to just have an item called tester. So we're going to grab the value of the item called tester, and then we're going to output that into our view area. And right now we don't have anything within the local storage, so we're actually not going to return anything back. So let's do a quick refresh, and I should update these as well. So view storage, and then we're just going to do add to storage. So refresh those. So we've got our view storage, and we've got add to storage. So we've got null right now within the storage. So now what we want to do, instead of just logging it out, we want to set it into the storage. So let's set that up, and we can do local storage, set item, and we need to set it by the same name that we're trying to retrieve it by. So tester, and then the value that we're storing is temp value. So we don't have an option here for a full object. And that's the interesting thing about it here, is that we don't have that option. And if we do try to store it as, so I'll try to put this JSON object in first, and then we'll update that after. And I'll just show you that it's not going to work like this. And that's one of the reasons, so that's why this is a good example of why we want to have this storage within this type of format, because it's within object. So it's really hard to grab that back in and then also make use of it because it's within an object format. And if we do something like temp holder and do a refresh, we see that it's just returning back object. So what we want to do ideally is, this is where we want to turn it into and set it as a stringified version. So we want to get, so if we want to use my JSON object and we want to update this, so if we have first name, and let's also say maybe we have last name as well. So yeah, if you have something a little bit more complex, and then we'll also do one for last name as well. So we'll just duplicate that out. And then we're going to turn it into an object last. And then this is just getting whatever the value of last name is. So let's turn that into an object. So let's do let my object. And then we're going to create our object. And we're going to do it within a JSON format. So we've got first. And then equal that to temp first. And then comma separated out. So then next we've got last and equal that to temp last. So we've got some values in there. And now it's also console log that out. So while we've got that object, we can log that out and we can see what it looks like. So I think we're ready. So let's try that out. And let's do test 4, add to storage. And we see that temp value, of course, is not defined. And let's try that one more time. So let's refresh. So let's do first, last name, add to storage. And again, we're adding it within an object format. So we're not able, if we go to view, we can't really easily see and view it. Even if I get rid of the clicked and we try to view it, you're going to see that it's still within this object format. So we got to break it out of the object format. And ideally, this is where we use the stringify and the parse in order to stringify it and place it within the local storage and then pull it out of the local storage and parse it. So now it's up to you. So I want you to try to set this up as well for yourself. So set up a couple inputs, add a few event listeners to a couple buttons, and then add in the content and set it up that you can stringify it before you set the item tester. And then once you get the item tester within a stringified format, before you output into the console, output it and parse it using JSON parse. So try it out for yourself, and I'll show you the solution coming up in the next lesson. In the previous lesson, we saw how we can use JSON parse and JSON stringify in order to better handle objects, turn them into strings, and then take those strings and turn them back into objects. And one of the cases that you might want to do this for is local storage, because it's going to save you a lot of trouble of setting up items when you can just do it as one kind of block string instead of having to convert it. So we've got our object over here, and we want to convert this object into a JSON format, a string format. And so we've got my object here, and we want to convert it. So we've got a number of options where we can convert it. So we can create another variable if we wanted to. We could do JSON stringify and then just wrap around it. So usually this is the way that I'll prefer to do that. Or you could do it when you're setting it within the local storage. So these ones are both options that you can use. So now when I add some content into here, and if I do add to storage, and if I view storage, I've got my string value here, just as what we saw earlier. So I have access to it and I can use it. And also let's clean up some of this code from before, because we actually don't need any of the stuff from before. I'll get rid of this stuff down here as well. So we're not outputting tons of stuff out into the console. And let me clean this up one more time. Let's make it bigger. And now we're storing it within a JSON format, so we're outputting it within JSON. I'm going to get rid of all of these console messages, and we're just storing it to our local storage. So next, what we want to do when we view it from storage, we want to output it into a usable format again. And the way to do that is that we're going to take that and we're going to parse it back into our usable format. So for now, we're just going to do JSON parse on the value. So this is a string value, remember, within tester, because we've converted our object into a string format. So if we want to make use of it one more time, so let's do add to storage, and then we'll do view storage. And you can see now, if I want to, I can manipulate the data, I can make use of it, and I can take that information and output it as well. So there's one other thing that I want to quickly add, and this is just kind of our way to hold the storage content. So we've got our my JSON, get rid of that, and we'll use const. So this is just going to be, call it const people, and from here we want to do a JSON parse of the local storage item. So let's do our local storage and then do get item. And the item that we're getting is tester. So that when the page loads, then we're actually going to parse this through and we're going to put it into our constant people. So right now, when the page loads, people is going to actually contain the content from tester. So let's show you how that works. So if we go to load out the contents of people, and let's refresh the page. So remember, this is getting it from the local storage because we've already deposited in there. But let's say this is the first time it's loading and there's nothing in there for tester, and we'll just rename tester to tester1. So the first time that we load it, we're actually not going to get any content. So we want to fix that. So we want the ability to actually be able to view content that's available within the people. So we can do people, and also let's add in the or. So within first and then last, and we'll also set that to none. So this is just a default if we don't have any values that are loaded. Let's refresh. And now this time we actually have content if we do view. So let's fix up view to make sure that we always have something that we can load. So instead of temp holder, local storage, get item, move this one out so we're consistent. If this one doesn't exist, then we'll just load whatever the contents of people are if they want to view the storage. And then if it does exist, so if we do view storage, we're getting that content. And now let's set something into storage. Remember, we're setting it into tester1. So add to storage. And now if I do view storage, I've got the content in there. If I refresh the page, by default, I've got the viewed storage. So this is basically a good use case for why you would be using JSON parse and JSON stringify. And it's also good when you're depositing content into the database. So go ahead and practice, try this out for yourself, adding in objects and also saving onto the local storage, and then pulling it out of the local storage and then adding it into updating the local storage as well. So try this out for yourself. JSON is used everywhere on the web. It's the most popular data format for exchanging data. So in this lesson, I'm going to show you how to connect to a file online that holds some JSON data. And we saw earlier that one of the resources that I was recommending that's really nice to use is the my.json. So we see we've got our first name there. And also, let's actually put in our information that's contained here as well. So we can put the first name, last name. Maybe we'll just format it like this. And then comma separate it out. I know this is super small, but let's put that in. And so we've got our first name, last name, comma separated, save it. And all I really want it to do is to be able to get that JSON file. So now when we output it, we've got a file online. So it's JSON, it's valid JSON. And we want to take this information and we want to use it within our JavaScript and output it on our page. So how do we do that? So first of all, I usually like to have a trigger or a button that gets the data. So we can, we'll just keep the add button there and we'll get rid of the rest of this HTML. So this will be get JSON. So now our button is going to be called get JSON. When we click it, we want to invoke and we want to get the JSON information. So we'll just clean this up a little bit here. And I'm going to set up some values. So do a const, make this bigger as well. So this is going to be my add. So this is add button. and we'll just grab that add button. I'm going to break this apart because it's awfully long. And then add button is going to have event handler. So whenever that gets clicked, then it's going to be add JSON. And that's going to be our function that gets invoked. And let's set that up. So add JSON function. So whenever that button gets clicked, and again, console log, and we'll just do clicked, just to make sure it's working, of course. So let's minimize this. And let's go back out to our JSON. So we'll keep that one open in the background there, and we're going to open up the get JSON. So refresh. So clicked is working. So our click button is working. Although it doesn't look like a button, you can obviously add styling if you want to make it look more like a button, of course. So next, we've got a way to trigger off our JSON. So at this point, we want to also have another div here, and maybe we can just call this one output. So now I'm trying to keep things super simple here. So we're just doing IDs, and then this one can be blank. And then over here, let's do output and then document. And we can also use query selector if we wanted to. So query selector. And then because this is an ID of output, make sure you have the hash. That's the thing when you use query selector, just like CSS, you got to make sure you either do the hash or the dot for the classes or just by the tag itself. So now we've got the output, and we can do output inner HTML, and let's do working. And all caps working. So we click the button and there's working. So we're actually able to update our HTML whenever we invoke our content, and we want to get that information that's contained within this JSON file, and I'm going to put it all on that same browser window there. So that's our JSON object that we want to get from online, and we want to output the first name and the last name into the output section. So next thing that we want to do is set up our fetch object. So let's do a URL. So the URL that we're fetching is going to be this one here. And fetch, for those of you that aren't familiar, so before with JavaScript, we did XHR requests, and then a lot of times Ajax was done with jQuery or other libraries, and now fetch is really a great way to get that data and make use of that data. So we just do the fetch, and then in here, let's do our URL. So it's promise based, and within then we're returning back a function. So a lot of time we just call it response. So this is simply going into the function, and then you can make use of that returned information within the function as needed. So we've got our promise then, and you can also console log out information here as well. So you could do a console log, and you can get the response object now that we've got one. And you can also get things like status if you want to. So let's see what happens. So go back, refresh, get JSON, clicked, and we're able to load. So we see that we get our status of 200. So that means it worked. We're returning back our JSON object. So we need to just transform that return content into a JSON format. So we can do a return, and the return can be the response text. And then we do our next promise, and this is where we actually output the content. So let's do another function, and then this one is going to actually hold the data. And we're going to also update this as well. So this is again out here, and then we can console log out the data that's being returned. So let's take a closer look at that. We get the JSON. We see that it returns it back within a string format. And of course, now if we wanted to, we could parse that data. So we could do a console log. As we saw earlier, we can do a JSON parse and take that data and parse it out. So again, try that one more time, and we parse it, and then we've got it within a usable format. But the nice thing about fetch is that it also has a built-in way of returning back that JSON data. So instead of response text, we can do response JSON, and that's going to transform it into a JSON format. And I'll show you, we're not going to have to parse it anymore. So there we go. So we're able to automatically get it and return it back within a JSON format. And of course, we don't need this console log anymore. And then at this point, once we've got our JSON object, now the next thing is the easy part. It's simply outputting it into our output area. So go ahead and try this out for yourself. Set up a function that's going to fetch to the URL where your JSON data is located. And then coming up next, I'll show you how you can loop through that data and then output it into your JavaScript. And you're also welcome to try that out as well. And I'll show you the solution coming up in the next lesson. Welcome back. I hope you had an opportunity to try out fetch. Now in this lesson, we want to output the results from the data and output it into our HTML. And this is actually going to be relatively easy because we saw in the earlier lesson that we're retrieving back the data. It's already within a JSON format, so a JavaScript object format. So it's going to be really simple to grab and use. So we've already hooked up our output. So we need to just grab output. We can do inner HTML, and we're going to set the inner HTML of output. So we can do first name and equals. And now within data first, we've got that object information, and then last name equals, and then add in the data last name. And of course, we can get all of those values that are there, so we can get age as well, and any number of values that are contained within our JavaScript or JSON object. So we could get age as well if we wanted to. So let's try that out. Click, and there we go. So we've got first name, last name being populated from this JSON file. So it's as easy as that to make your AJAX request, return back some content, and then output that content into your HTML. So we want to actually do something a little bit more complex coming up in the next lesson. So the exercise is going to be using an API. So random user ME is a great open source API, and it's useful for generating user data. So this is simply random user data. These people don't actually exist. Well, I'm sure they exist, but not as they're represented here within the generator. So this is a great way to get filler content if you want some user content. And you can see that I've got results 1. I can also do results 10, and then right away this becomes a whole lot less readable. And remember earlier where we could grab JSON data and we could use a resource like JSON lint. We could paste it in there and check to see if it's valid JSON, but we can also get it in a more readable format. And this is also really helpful when you have these JSON objects that are very complex. They might have an object, and then they've got an array within there, and then they might have multiple results within that array. So you need to be able to loop through that and output the content as needed. And I'll show you all of that coming up in the next lesson, where we're going to first start out by retrieving back just the one user and then outputting it into our HTML. And then we're going to load several users, 10 users, and also output that into our HTML. And this is going to be a great practice exercise to get more familiar with JSON and how it works in JavaScript. This lesson is going to be a lot of fun, and it's going to be a great way to practice JSON, especially when you have more complex JSON objects, such as the one from random user. So we see we've got a lot of values in there, and it's all contained within the results array. So that's the one that we're going to be first using when we retrieve back that data. So let's go ahead and grab that URL, and we'll make some quick updates to our code. We'll keep the button, so this is going to trigger getting the JSON, and maybe we'll do now get user, so we're getting that user. So that can all stay the same. The output, that one is fine as well. We can get rid of the clicked because we know that it's working. We can get rid of that as well. And let's update our API. So let's paste the URL. We can get rid of this console. We'll keep the console data because this is always a great way to kind of parse through your content. And now let's try it out and let's see what data we're retrieving back from random user ME. So it's refresh, hit get user, and you'll see that we get this results. So it's an array. And this is where the main information is being kept. So if we had multiple users, So let's change that to 10. And then we'll go back to 1 just to try that out. So this time we have the results array has 10 items in there. And we know that with JavaScript, we can really easily loop through arrays. So I'll show you how to do that as well coming up. So for now, let's just work with the one result. And let's go back in here. And we see that we're returning back that one result. So usually the way that I like to do it is I want to set a variable, and I'm going to just call it person. So this is going to contain all of the results, or we can call it people, so that when we're coming up and we're creating more, we've got all of the results within people. And then console log, instead of just console logging out the results, we'll log out people. So this is also going to be a value that we're going to be able to loop through. So make that small again, hit get user, and there's our array of people. So this one is going to be the first one. We know we only have one. So this actually makes it really easy to output that content. So if we wanted to output the first name and last name of the user, so we've got the first name, last name. So in this case, it's name, first, last. So just like you would with any JavaScript object, you can traverse down. So let me show you how we're going to do that within the code. So I've got it here on the left-hand side. So people is equal to all of the results here. And if we want to get the first result, because it's an array, we can do 0. So let's try that. So now we've got just the first person, just the first object that's available in there. So how do we get to name? How do we get this name information? And because now it's just a JavaScript object, and we saw this earlier before where I can do name and refresh again, and I can really zero in on that object, that name object. So now it's just a matter of doing first and last. So first. And if you're also, you can do it within that bracket format as well. So you could do it within this way as well. That's all valid. It's a little bit, usually I do prefer this object type format, but again, it's up to you. So we've got our first and then our last. So now when I go to the inner HTML, so we can do first and we can do last. So now we've got first name, last name, and every time we click it, we get a different first name and last name. And we can also style this a little bit better now as well. So if we wanted to do a new line, so refresh. So now we're getting random people, first names and last names. So it's as easy as that to work with an API, pull that information and use it within your JavaScript. So now it's up to you. So try this out for yourself. Grab the API. So you can use the same one that I'm using within this lesson, the randomuser.me/API, and just grab one result, or you don't need one by default, it will just show you the one, and then you can return that information back and then make use of it within your JavaScript code. And coming up next, I'll show you how we can handle 10 results. So that's going to be even more interesting. Welcome back, and I hope you had an opportunity to try out getting back some results from the API. And right now in this lesson, we're going to increase the results to 10, and we're no longer going to output it within our HTML because we've got some updates that we still have to do, but we are going to output that value into the console log so we can see what's being returned back. So when we click the button, we see that we get an array being returned back. So we want to use this array, we want to iterate through all of the values within the array and then output it into our output container and output it within our HTML. So before that, let's set up a quick little test. And I want to show you how map works. So we'll just call it test button, and we'll call it test map. So we'll have another button there that we can click, and it'll do something within our JavaScript. And this is just for testing purposes in order to demonstrate how maps are going to work. So we'll call it test button, and over here, get element by ID test button, and we're going to call it tester. And then let's set up our function. So this function is also called tester, And this is what's going to actually get initiated, invoked, whenever we click that second button. So I like to, again, just make sure that things are working, and we need to update the test button with, sometimes when you copy and paste, this type of thing happens. So let's try that one more time. So save that and refresh it, and this time we see that it's working. So that's exactly what we wanted. And we want to actually test out how we can output content from an array. So let's say, for instance, we have just a basic array. So we'll call it temp array, and we'll assign some values. So these are just some random values. So there we go. So we got some random values. And then what we want to do with those values is we want to build out another array out of it. So test temp array 2. And we're going to take the values from the temp array. We're going to map them out into our function. And then within this function, we're going to take the values, and then we can do something with those values. So for now, let's just console log out those values. Or actually what we're going to do is we're going to return something. So we'll take val, we'll multiply it by 2, and then just down here below, we'll console log out the value that's contained within the temp array 2. So what do you think is going to happen here when we click the button? What's going to be output here? This is temp array 2. So it's taking all of the values of temp array 1, it's mapping them, applying some functionality, returning some values, and then actually outputting it within our console. So let's refresh and try that out. So you see what happened here is that using map gave us the ability to iterate through all of the values within the array as we built out a brand new array. And then within this brand new array, we were just taking that initial value and we were multiplying it by 2. And that's how we constructed our brand new array. So there's actually a great way to build out your HTML as well using the map function. So let me show you how that works. So we're going to grab the value, and we can also get the index value if we wanted to. So we'll just call it I for index. And you can see that we can also add the index value to it if we wanted to. So that's going to be another value that's going to be contained within there. And this actually gives you another option as well. So now instead of just being multiplied out, we're also adding that initial value of I to it. So the first iteration has value times 2, so it's 4 times 2 plus 0, and then we're doing 5 times 2 plus 1, and so on. So you can see the pattern there that's being built out there. So we're taking in those values and then we're utilizing them within our HTML. So what I wanted to do instead is to actually build out our inner HTML. So I'm going to return back a list item, and then within this list item, I can have maybe some dynamic values. So I'll have the value times 2, and then we're going to close off those list items. And then within here, we're going to use this I as well. So just close this one off, and we'll put an equal sign there and a plus. So now we're building out some HTML. So next step is to take our values that we're returning back. So let's, instead of temp array, we'll call it HTML. So we'll build out an HTML value. And right now when I go with the HTML, you're going to see that what's being logged out here is not, it's still going to be within an array format, but we have a really quick way with JavaScript how we can take this array and we can actually convert it back into a string value, so we can remove out all of the array functionality. And we can do that with JavaScript join. So what we're doing is we're simply joining together and outputting that joined value. So let's try that one more time and refresh. And now it looks like we do have some HTML within a string format. So the next step is just to update our inner HTML, and we can do that within this type of format. So we'll just do an unordered list, and we're going to add the HTML to it, and then we're going to close off the unordered list, and we'll do it like that. So let's try this out one more time.